Wendy Lund, thank
Hello.
you. How are you?
Good. How you doing?
I am doing pretty well. Thank you so much for joining us in the lab today. Super excited. I've told you this to have you on. Someone who's spent, close to 25 years in health, wellness, communications. And I know you've always been at the forefront of new and innovative ways, let's say, to market in your industry. And you're one of the most successful marketers I know in communication professionals, not just your area in health and wellness, but really across all industries. So we're so lucky to have you today and someone who's seen so much. And I wanted to start on a high level first, and we're going to talk a lot about corporate podcasts, branded podcasts. But on a high level today, what major differences do you see from 25 years ago in marketing and communication tactics than back in the day?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Love to be on any type of live show with you, Robert. So glad to be here. I know we met not long ago, but ever since then, there's been an affinity to talk about all things related to podcasts and entrepreneurship. So very, very happy to be here. It's funny. I was thinking about this, and it may even be a little more than 25 years, but there are certain things that stay the same and certain that have changed so drastically. If you were to say to me, is it the same? I'd say no. But would you say, are there things that we still have to do? Yes. So, I think at the base of it, we're still talking the same marketing tenets around, strategies, insights, plans, and all the things that you have to do as a really strong marketer to really understand your audience. But the good news is we have so many more channels to work with now that we didn't have back in the day. And there are certain stakeholders that are considered so much more important now than they were back in the day. So I think marketers have a lot to work with today, and technology and innovation has driven so much of this.
Well, let's talk about that because recently we've certainly seen Amaze Media Labs, a company that produces podcasts for organizations, a ton of them coming from companies in the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry. And lately, I say the last year and a half, 2 years, but you actually came to us and worked with us on a podcast, going back prior to this. And why was a podcast so important for you and your business at that time?
Yeah, so great question. So when I was leaving the job before going in-house, podcasts were very much top of mind for me. I kept coming back to our team saying, how do we do a podcast around putting people and patients at the center when it comes to health, and really helping marketers make sure that they were doing everything in their power to consider the patient voice and the patient mindset. So this was kind of on my mind already when I moved over to, in-house. And then it just seemed so natural. So when I got over, one of the first things I said to a couple of people on my team was, can we create a podcast? And they just jumped on it, and they were really excited. And we had a lot of opportunity to work with so many different diverse viewpoints and diverse people. And we were like, let's do something different and not make this kind of like your everyday rote, let's talk about every area of women's health that's, a disease within women's health, but really talk about all the things that people skirt and don't really talk about, and really try to eliminate taboos and demystify what's happening in women's healthcare around both the science, the whole category, as well as sort of the business of women's health.
The podcast did extremely well, incredibly well. In fact, charted, which is very unusual for a lot of B2B podcasts, although that could happen. And it was focused on women's health. When you were working, to format that with our team and create kind of a schedule of episodes, in terms of the content and the people you wanted to interview, were there specific types of people, or was there a pattern you followed, or was it just across the board?
So everything was kind of built off the same thread, which was, let's have diverse voices. Let's have voices that people rarely hear from, but who might be more high profile, but they're kind of stuck in terms of what they're talking about. People are really not talking about. And then the other piece of it, I talked to a couple of people that had done podcasts, and one of the wise lessons I heard was let your guests do the talking, and you're really there to facilitate the actual guests. So not so much like I'm Oprah Winfrey and I'm here to interview you, but or Kelly Clarkson, who's another one of my faves on the talk show circuit, but more around, how do we get the best out of these guests and help them kind of liberate themselves from being stuck in and not really getting to talk very often about this area of expertise they might have.
Talk about, podcasts. And one of the things that brands and companies love about it is kind of what you just said. You get to have really empathetic conversations, deep conversations with people. And why is that such a valuable tool for any communications professional or marketer?
So I think, if you think about the listeners of the podcasts, they can be, to your point, more B2B, potential customers or current customers. It could be potentially professionals. Could be just everyday consumers who are interested in health and wellness podcasts, and it could be your employees. So good news is our podcast served all four purposes and really wanted to, put like our best foot forward in terms of bringing the best thinking together. And like I said before, topics that had never really been talked about before.
Yeah. You're a communications professional, but I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, this was the first podcast that you actually hosted.
It was definitely my first podcast I ever hosted. It was sort of like a dream made for me because I'm a continuous learner. So everybody that I got to talk to, and I really feel like that authenticity and that conversation really came through. Even people that I knew for 20 something years, some of my guests I knew for many years, I learned something new from them. And the hope was that the people listening learned something new as well. And it was always trying to sort of elicit, what was the key insight or understanding or information that people maybe never heard before, which made it so interesting.
Yeah, you did an incredible job, and we get a lot of hosts who come from companies, and they're a little nervous at first, but I think you're a natural. You took right to it, and it really came across. And a big reason the podcast did so well is because of you, and of course of the content that you formatted, created, and the interviews. If you were, in-house, let's say today, again, at a pharmaceutical company, how would you start the process depending on, depending on the company, how would you start the process of thinking if a podcast is right for you?
Yeah, so I think as any tool in your communications arsenal, you want to think about what is the key objective of using a podcast? Who are you trying to reach? And what do you want to talk about? And then how does it tie back to your business goals? So that is something I would start with 100%. If you're talking and you're in the area of heart disease and you want to talk with a hockey player, well, we want to make sure that hockey player is telling a story that's going to tie back to what your ultimate goal is in sharing either prevention information or disease information or treatment information or aftercare information or just how to take care of yourself, wellness information. So definitely having the thread that can be pulled right through. And I think that starts with some just basic marketing approaches in terms of, why are you doing this? A podcast should be done for a reason. There should be an end goal. There should be people that you're trying to reach in a certain way. You should be framing out your questions and your stories that come back in your conversation in a certain way so that the stakeholders that you care about are going to hear it and learn from it and then have a stronger connection to your company or to your brand. So it's not something that just gets thrown together. It really does take some methodical thought, but having great partners like yourselves to really help guide that was very important to us as well. And then having the ability to really understand the reach. So, when you develop these podcasts, coming to experts like yourselves to really understand, like, how are we getting this out there, into the Apples and the Spotifys of the world so that when people, let's say employees who are driving to work or employees that are listening into it while they're on the floor. You want to just make it really, really accessible to people, but you also want to make sure that you can get as broad reach as possible through the way you work with the company, a company like yourself, to make sure you get the strongest reach possible and the most targeted reach.
What did you think also about the aspect? I know, in terms of a lot of marketing and communications tactics in the past that, they were put out there and kind of, you couldn't really, do things or listen to something or watch something on your own time. Was that one of the big factors that you really saw in a podcast, that people were able to listen to this and educate themselves while entertaining themselves on their own time?
I feel like we fell into that more organically. Ultimately, we were originally looking at, what's the content going to look like? How do we create content and build our brand to tell our story through this podcast without being deliberate about it, right? So by talking about different areas of different diseases or science and technology, or how things might be practiced in a nurse practitioner or a physician or HCP's office, like those were kind of things we were thinking about. Like, what is the content going to look like so it'll engage people? But I ultimately think, based on the many different emails and texts and messages I got, that the applicability and the flexibility for people to basically listen to this wherever they were. They don't have to be watching television to see the ad or reading a journal. This is in the comfort of their car, their home, their office, when they feel like, it really plays to today's consumer. And when I say consumer of information, so that consumer of information is not necessarily a typical you and me consumer. It's like who we're really trying to talk to. So that was something we fell into and saw the incredible applicability and flexibility of using podcasts that really play to our advantage.
If we look at the pharma and wellness industries, health and wellness today, there's a lot of major companies, and there's a lot of companies that are doing kind of podcasts that you did, which was external facing. But a lot of companies are doing internal podcasts. What's the reason a company would do, let's say, their own podcast for their own employees and partners?
I would say that a podcast internally is an incredible tool, because today, in this hybrid environment, you're not going to get everyone in ever on one day unless you have an enormous, party, or you're having a huge town hall. So being able to share your messages, inspire people, motivate them, make sure they're informed via podcasts, whether it's and also being able to bring personalities of the company to life. And I don't mean like high profile personalities, although that's part of it, but like people doing the actual work, right? And, everyday people who are doing things that are, miraculous in many ways, saving lives, doing great things. And the beauty of that is that not only is it a way to inform and engage, but it's also a way to inspire, because every healthcare company is doing something to serve someone else, whether it's saving lives or making people healthier or more well. And so that purpose is very important. This is why people join up with healthcare companies. This is why we work in healthcare. And so being able to spread that through companies and inspire people and remind them why they're here, a podcast can achieve all of that. So I would say, a podcast is as necessary a tool internally as using emails, an intranet, all the tools of the trade that you use when you're internal, town halls. I would say a podcast should be on that, foundational checklist.
Yeah, I love how you talk about, thinking about, hey, a podcast, an internal podcast, sure, you could have the CEO or the chief communications officer, but even those stories of everyday people who you might work with, might not know because your company's so big, and to be able to hear their story, what they do on a daily basis, I assume that's great, authentic content for a company.
Yeah. And on top of that, what they do and how they are driving forward the success of that company, or something very complex and interesting, or how they did something very innovative that no one actually had any idea about, but also their personal journeys. Everyone has a story to tell in health. whether it's, everyday wellness or cancer. And I think people in general like to bring these stories upfront and personal because they can help other people. They can help other people understand the journey that they went on or their family member went on. And so podcasts can do all that, help bring these stories to life and really humanize people and help people really connect the dots on certain areas.
Yeah, it's a great point. Do you think when we look at podcasts from pharmaceutical companies and health and wellness companies, you know, that there really just is that natural fit for a podcast because, as you said, you're talking about real life, real stories, and this medium gives you that opportunity to dive deep?
1,000%. So this is a multi-dimensional tool that is very different than an email, right? Where you just read the words off a page and you're like, okay, I'm informed and now I know what I need to do. A podcast offers so much more dimensionality into people. And I think one of the things that's hard in healthcare is really dimensionalizing people and understanding that there's, so many things that go into what a person is and who they are and where they come from. And so when you have these guests on, you learn so much about things you never ever knew about these people, or, and people become much more real, much more relatable. You feel empathy. There's just a whole connection that exists that will never exist with some of the other tools that we use when we communicate with staff.
Yeah. When we talk about external facing podcasts, like the podcast you created when you were last in house, which did extremely well, talk about how bringing on the people you did and thought leaders, how does that help with your own company's credibility and branding?
So one of the things I think so important when you are in-house at a company is, if you look at your overall vision and your overall purpose as a company, is to really be thinking through all the ifs and ands about that and how you can bring that to life in many different ways. So it doesn't have to just be about a disease, or it doesn't have to just be about a treatment, which is, I think, where, we always kind of want to go down that road because it's going to help like drive uptake or sell a product. The beauty of this is that, if you're working in a general area, let's say you're working in an area where you want to focus on patient rehabilitation, I'll just make that up. And you have, let's say it's for older people, right? You can do so many things with that, right? You can do things that are more patient targeted. You could do things that are more wellness targeted. You could do things around nutrition. You can do things about even beauty. So the thing about a podcast is you can take a much more, diverse, multidimensional look at all the different areas and then what happens there is that people begin to look at this and respect you, that you're not just like going down trying to just sell, but you're actually really trying to support and educate and align and connect and bring people something that they probably wouldn't have gotten somewhere else around a certain topic.
Yeah, it's so true. And you did such a great job of that on your series and show. And, a lot of industries we deal with, we create podcasts for insurance industries, financial industries, pharmaceutical. There are a lot of legalities, right, when it comes to how you market, how you could market. It seems like there's advantages for just some of those reasons you talked about, before, because you're telling stories, you're not selling product. Tell me about the fact of podcasts and why, for those reasons, they might turn out to be even better sellers when you're just talking about authentic stories.
I think people in general don't want to be sold to anymore. I think people want to be learning and growing through all of these different tools. I think, people have been very overly exposed to health the past 3 years. COVID really drove a significant amount of consumer awareness. We have Dr. Google. So I think, people don't need to be sold to on, how to treat this. But I think what they do need to know more about is the things that they care about, right? So, how is the science progressing? What is the innovation that's potentially in the lab? How are people dedicating themselves to this? Who are the leaders in the space? And, what is the inspiration behind where they came from and what they're doing? And I think at the end of the day, we have a bunch of very smart people out there who really want to learn and grow and then make their own decisions about how they're going to basically, in conjunction with their HCP, how they're going to seek out their health. So it takes a lot of different avenues to get to that person. And this is just one of them. But I think giving them the more 360 view of what actually, surrounds that health issue or that wellness issue gives them a lot more to work with, because they become so much more knowledgeable and knowledgeable with relevant, real information.
Yeah, that's what I love about podcasts too, because you kind of hearing it from the horse's mouth, and especially when you're doing podcasts where you are bringing on people who are experts in subjects, and it's not just a quick clip or bit or whatever it might be. And it seems like you were able to capture that with your podcast and the one you did. If you're a company that's starting out and thinking, hey, uh, I'm not sure who we're going to bring up. We want to be seen like that too, but I'm not sure we have those thought leaders out there. How do you go about maybe finding clients, or actually finding people to bring on the show? Is it clients? What are good ways to look at that for a company that's just maybe
Yeah.
starting out with the podcast?
Yeah, so I think like anything, first of all, we had a great partner in your team who, came together with us and shared with us the kind of guests that will work best.
Mm,
And I think that's really, really important. Most of our guests had been vocal or published or written, or they had some notoriety, whether it's small or large. There was definitely a strong expertise and strong authority around them that I felt like I could give them any question and they would answer it, like, just with so much grace and so much elegance and so much smarts. I think part of it is people just digging into their banks of, who they know, and connect dots on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great source for
yes.
that. And what I've connections, connections, connections. It's all about networking and not shying away. And one of the things that I found was that there were certain people that we may not have known at all and who were very high profile, CEOs of nonprofit organizations. But once you go to them or their people and say, this is for a really important reason, you're going to get your voice heard. It's very legitimate, and you're going to also be able to tell hopefully thousands, if not millions of people about how to take better care of themselves, or what they should do in certain situations, or how they may want to sift through information, or what they can do to drive an issue, or a movement or whatever. Most of them were very, very open to it. In fact, we started to have people at the end coming to us asking if they could be on, which I guess is the great, the truest form of flattery, right? When people start asking you, can they be on? So it comes together. It comes together. You just have to, like anything, start, talk, ask, connect, ask again, and it happens.
Yeah, it's so true. It's really amazing just thinking about it, because that becomes a fear of some companies saying, well, who are we going to bring on? How are we going to get them? And it really, you really do find that, especially people who are thought leaders and people who are in an industry, what's really important is they love to share their knowledge. And the one thing that you were able to do that I thought was incredible was, it was educational, it was a learning experience, but you also made it entertaining. With your style, how were you able to do that?
Well, I love people. And COVID for someone like me was like, besides the fact of living in fear of getting COVID or my family getting COVID, was, being trapped in a house,
Yeah.
definitely ready to jump out and, be out there. So extreme extrovert. And I love learning from people. I love conversations. I love to ask questions. I've been like that since I'm a little girl. My mother's famous for asking a lot of questions. So for me, it was kind of a natural thing because I just love people. But even if you don't, and even if you're more introverted, there's a role for everyone in this. A lot of it's around preparation and really understanding
Mm,
and getting to know who your guests are going to be. And to your point, there were moments where I felt very personally connected to what they were saying. And so while most of the time I really wanted to give the guests, 95% of the time their voice, but there were times for me where they would talk about a certain area and I'd be like, I totally hear you. I relate. I remember when, and could share my own little stories and, journeys. And that was fun too. And then we could get into a little bit more of, a Gabby kind of discussion, keeping in mind that, thousands of people could be listening. But, I think at the end of the day, every single guest that I had on, and I think this would go for any podcast in health, is looking to really help educate people and help people, whether they're suffering from a disease or trying to just stay healthy. Ultimately, I think most guests who come on see a real reason for this, that they're going to inform and educate and help people. And that's why people do it.
Well, I've always thought that too, especially in your industry with these types of podcasts, being able to hear real stories from real people. And if you are, let's say, talking about a disease or a certain situation you're going through, to be able to hear someone you might not know, but someone who's experiencing it, to me, that's the most authentic and best opportunity, not to sell, but really to showcase your brand. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And, one of like the lost pieces here is, caregiving, right? Like all of us, huge generation of people living in the sandwich generation where we're taking care of, children and parents, and we're lacking our own attention to ourselves. But there's something huge, I think, that is yet to be uncovered in the podcast world around how to be a caregiver, especially in more serious diseases, oncology, Alzheimer's disease, other neuro diseases. As parents get older, there's so much still to be shared and gained. And I think that's a big one, being able to bring on people who could help people. And I think in the end, that would really connect back with companies because they're trying to talk about areas that affect these patients and these caregivers, and like connecting all of that together, I think could be very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, we all see commercials. There's lots of commercials on television, and it's a quick smiley faces and people doing things. And of course, that's a great way to get it out there that there is this medication. But the fact I love with podcasting, and what I think you did such a great job at, was bringing out those stories, because when you do hear those stories and you learn from those people, there's just such an incredible connection. And, I also love what you talked about in terms of when you actually had that connection, because I host a podcast too for entrepreneurs. And it's just, how great is that when like someone says something and like you just connect and it does become so real.
And then the other thing is that's very important is that these experts and these authorities are now connected to your company. So when you go back to them and say, hey, I would like to talk about a partnership or potentially working with you on something, or just need your advice, or, we'd like to feature you, they're very inclined to do that. They feel more loyal, they feel more connected. And, that means you have all these new friends who are your new partners. And, I think of everyone who was on our podcast, each of them brought something different, so different, such a different voice. And we're all so instrumental to the importance of the area we were in.
Yeah, it does bring that when you bring on those folks onto your podcast, these people who are influencers, thought leaders, just in general, like you said at the beginning, head of nonprofits, you establish this connection, because having a 30 or 40-minute conversation with someone is really intimate, and they get to know you and learn about you. And it seems like from your podcast, you were able to develop these incredible relationships for your company and for yourself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Some of them were people that I had known for 20 years, and some of them I met on the podcast. But the ultimate, I think you would look at each of the podcasts as the same level of warmth and connectedness, because they genuinely wanted to be there and I genuinely wanted to learn from them. And I think that was sort of our connected tissue. But there's absolutely no doubt about it that there's huge opportunity for companies. And I think the one thing companies need to remember when they do these, especially in the pharma space, is like the whole idea around open-mindedness. It's not just about, like, as I said, selling a certain product and doing like every single podcast on that type, something related to that product. It's kind of looking at the bigger picture and knowing that your reputation will be built. You'll connect people to your brands through this. You'll have lifelong, authorities and experts at your fingertips. You will reach multitudes of people and very diverse audiences, and it will be a great motivator and inspirer for staff.
It's so true. And I couldn't have said it better. Just from, we work with probably over 15 pharmaceutical companies, whether they're internal podcasts or external podcasts. And the one thing we always stress when we're developing the content with them, and this, is to create authentic content, not selling, because at the end of the day, that's going to do your brand and your company more good than the company that goes out there and is like talking about a specific product or selling it. And I think, and I want you to elaborate on this, because you said it at the beginning, that authenticity, people don't want to be sold to anymore. It seems like podcasts are able to do that, but why has this changed so much, and why has that changed over the past several years?
Yeah, I think people digest information just much more differently. I think the audible piece of it is attractive to people because they can do it wherever they want to do it. There's a lot of flexibility. You can fast forward, you can go back, you pick the pieces you want to be a part of. The information's more of snippets versus, reading like a 3-page document. And it will, there's so much connectedness back to brands and companies, depending on how you structure it. So, I mean, I highly recommend it because I would do it in a heartbeat if I could right now, and would recommend it to a lot of different people. The other thing is that I love about a podcast is that, it's part of an omni-channel mix, even on the corporate side. It's, doing it by itself will have strength, but doing it in conjunction with other things makes it that much stronger. So having that, being able to share it on LinkedIn and then maybe using LinkedIn as sort of a way to expand on it and blow it out, having it go out on all internal channels, and, the list kind of goes on and on, using snippets of it. There could be quotes from within the podcast that can be pulled. It's very multi-purpose, and, it's just about, and it's easy stuff. It's not hard stuff to do.
Yeah, and what I love about it too, especially on the health and wellness side, a lot of the content that you're creating is evergreen. So you can utilize it, like you said, across all these channels at different times. And I've noticed a lot of clients, will use it, they might take a piece from that podcast and use it 2 weeks later. It might not even promote the podcast. It might just promote some really relevant information at that time. And it seems like you understood that from the beginning, that a podcast is kind of this funnel of content.
Yeah, I mean, people I worked with at one job ago, not my last job, but my job before, would probably laugh because I was very naive to how podcasts worked. And I was like, let's just start it up right here in the office. And like, I didn't realize all the nuances around it and what it takes, but it's very simple to do. And the equipment is very accessible, and it can be done in the comfort of your home. We should mention that we did the entire podcast during COVID. It was not done in an office. It was done in people's homes. And I was set up like a little broadcaster. And I know there's many other people who did podcasts during that time who were also set up the same way. And our guests were able to technologically, zoom in and use the equipment as well. And it worked really, really well. So the other thing is that it's very fit for purpose to do podcasts today, because you don't have to be in the office to do any of it. And it was like sort of the perfect tool to use during COVID.
And it seemed like for you too, it used to be like, and when I started it's funny, prior to the pandemic, maybe a year, you'd go meet the person, in a studio or at their office, wherever it might be. And what I loved about the fact, especially we've created this incredible virtual studio that our clients use that's 99.9% as good as being in person. But we have sometimes the host in California interviewing someone who's in Europe,
Yep.
which opens up the door. And it seems like for you, just opens the door to so many people that you can speak with and bring on to your show.
Well, that and also the access, right? So you're right. Like you can do it from all corners of the earth. You can be in the North Pole, the South Pole, it doesn't matter where you are. But also the accessibility. And one of the things I loved about it was hearing from people all over the world. And, I had to shut down my New York accent where I could because I talk so fast. But hearing from like South Africa and the Middle East and Europe and all over Asia and hearing from all over the place, and it didn't have to be on that time zone, right? It could be picked up and listened to when it was convenient. But these messages really were global messages in many ways, and they pertain to people all over the world. So that was one of the other parts, very, very accessible tool.
Well, I will say, the podcast that you created, at your last company, it was so inspiring and shocking, not to say this, but to me, just how well it did, because you were really targeting, first off, females, certain demographic, but the show resonated so much. And I think that comes across from people seeing and hearing you today and your genuine interest, but also, like you said, the content you developed. So really, it's incredible what you and your team were able to develop. And like you said, that must have made you feel so good to, it wasn't about just hearing from people in New York or in the US.
Yeah.
Like, people are listening to podcasts in Australia and they're listening to podcasts in Europe, and it's growing everywhere. So that must have really just felt so good.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I first began and said this thing about let's do a podcast, just the enthusiasm of our team made me really excited. But I will say where they took it and how they built it out and how it tied back to our corporate brand and the guests we were able to, come together on, it's not just one person, right? It takes a team to do everything. And there were a lot of people who put a lot of work into this, and I'm very appreciative of them. It's not a simple task, just get it done, like that. But it is very doable, very, very doable. And so I was very, very grateful to the people who not only were very enthusiastic, but dug in and got it done so well.
Yeah, and it was great
Including your team.
working with, yeah, thank you. And working with your team, that's such a great point, because we find half of the podcasts we get now, or business to create new podcasts, actually we call it our repair shop, because it's people who've gone out there, didn't really focus on maybe the content, didn't have a host, didn't have the right equipment, right? And sound, that's the most important thing, first off, right? So we send a microphone, you have a microphone, every guest we would send a microphone to.
Yep.
Just from little things like that help. But that really worked was your team and helping and putting it together and tying in the content you used in so many other different areas into this show, and then this show becoming this top of the funnel machine. And I know we're running out of time. I wanted to ask you, one last question. With your expertise, you've been doing this for so long. You've been an innovator. You started your podcast, one of our very first ones, very few. We have 75 now in 2 years, because
Wow.
it's just growing. The opportunity to share this way has had, people are understanding it. You understood it before a lot of people. The last question I wanted to ask you, in terms of audio and in terms of what people are doing with audio, with podcasts, with vodcasts now, where are things for our listeners who are saying, hey, we want to do the next one? Where are things headed, do you think, in terms of audio and video and podcasts?
I think they're just going to grow. Video, very popular. We look at YouTube, as a search engine. We look at TikTok as a search engine. Clearly, people really, really, really engage well with video. I think audio, it serves two purposes that I love. One is that you don't have to look at anything. You can drive and listen. You can walk and listen. So all those things that we like to do to stay fit and to just be safe, audio is perfect. I think this will continue. I think podcasts, just given the popularity of them today, I don't see them going anywhere. There was a moment like in time, I think I'm just dating myself, where podcasts came out and they kind of like waned in
Yeah.
right. And then they shot up, and this was before COVID. And then during COVID, they maintained and grew in popularity. Stream, pop culture,
Yeah.
fun, mysteries, all that stuff. But I really, really hope that over the next 5 years, that healthcare marketers will really dig in and see the incredible opportunity they have to drive so many different things through the use of podcasts. I don't think we've even tipped the iceberg there. I think a lot of stuff has been around wellness versus like health, right?
Yeah. That's so
And
true.
and so that's to me the frontier for our industry, which is how to use this in a useful, supportive way where people listening will get something out of it and take some kind of action, to either help another person or a patient, or for themselves, whether they're in a stakeholder position as a customer or whether they're an everyday consumer. So I think we have some work to do there. So I don't see things going away quite yet.
Yeah, that definitely sounds good to me. So, Wendy, I wanted to thank you. Always so incredible to hear your insight. I can't tell you how many people had emailed me prior and were so excited that they were going to have the opportunity to listen to you. How many people I've met since we only recently met in the last year and a half who have said such incredible things about you as a
Oh, thanks.
person and connector, and who wanted to be connected to you. So sorry about all those people I send your way. But in any case,
Totally fine.
I do want to thank you for coming on. This has definitely been an incredible in the lab, and your insight really resonates. And I think a lot of people are going to take away a lot from this episode. So thank you.
Great. Thank you.